to get a foundation. Yeah, so
So, I think a brief note about Extinction Rebellion. You probably know a bit about us. Non-violent direct action group. I mean, that's how I found out about Extinction Rebellion back last April. They did a couple of things beforehand, but didn't make the news. But that's not just what we're about. So, we aim to save humanity from extinction. I mean, it's a bit of a grand title, but let's talk about like how serious this is. How tongue-in-cheek is this? I don't think I haven't met many people who've got one of those sort of God or Messiah complexes about here. We're mostly just idiots like ourselves, or well-meaning. So we've got two parts, this, as Kaitlyn mentioned, the truth and what we need to do. And this part focuses on the truth. So XR has three demands. So outward facing, we were only asking for three things, only asking. So tell the truth about the ecological crisis and declare a climate emergency. This is what we're kind of going to do now, try and tell the truth about the climate crisis. But really, the government could be doing this. You should be well informed of what the Paris Agreement is, what the IPCC 2018 report is, what the UN emissions gap is. You should know about this inside and out, like, fun little animations and all that sort of stuff. But we'll try and run through it here. Greenhouse gas, net zero, and also biodiversity as well. Loss halted by 2025, a ridiculous idea. The first time I heard it, I work in this field. Net zero by 2025 seems ridiculous, but we'll think about how you feel about this figure now and see how you feel about it in 20 minutes. And citizens' assemblies, we bang on about this, maybe that'll come up in the last part. We think these problems are too big for everyday politics. So just a quick brief overview. I like McGrath's. There's a graph, there's carbon dioxide fluctuations over the last 800,000 years. Right, and it goes from zero. Always be aware of people who cut the axes. So it goes from zero upwards. So usually fluctuates between about 200 and about 280 parts per million. That's kind of the natural variation. This is what geology does. This is what the orbit of the Earth does. That's the effect of, these are big effects, and that's what they do to the CO2. Now, that's what it should look like. So that isn't zero going back from now. This is zero when Jesus was born. And then that's what we've done in 200 years. Right? In 200 years, we've done more than all of the natural background fluctuations. So, which is, it's impressive or staggering. CO2 doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to warm the Earth. It just happens to warm the Earth. Science could be different. It's just not. So there's the last 2,000 years. There's the last 500 years. Interesting little dip here at 1600. So 100 years earlier, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas, introduced the native inhabitants to Eurasian diseases. 60 million people died in an area the size of France, went back to forestry, and that's the blip in CO2 in the atmosphere. That's the effect of introducing Eurasian diseases to the Americas. And that's what we have to take care of. So whenever we talk about planting trees, they are a solution. But you need about 11 Frances, like the whole size of France multiplied by 11. You need to reforest maybe like a little bit more than Europe. So it is a partially solution, but just bear in mind the severity of the task we're looking at. So one thing to note from this graph is the majority of this has happened in the last 50 years, from about 1960 odd to from about the 1960s. That's when the majority of this has happened. So we'll start off half a century of dithering and denial. So this is from The Guardian, but it's a selection of quotes from starting in 1959. 1959, we'd released 27% of the carbon dioxide we would do up until 2017. So I think this chemical contamination is more serious than most people tend to believe. At that point, they were talking about CO2 as being a chemical contaminant. We stopped thinking about it that way. Why has this happened? Anyway, we'll move on. 1965, fast forward 6 years, we've got another 5% more ticked onto the ticker. Lyndon B. Johnson, still referring to this as a pollutant, CO2 as a pollutant. We don't really think of it as a pollutant now, We think about NOx and SOx, nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides and stuff that comes out of diesel generators, pollutants, or diesel cars. We don't really think about CO2 as itself being a pollutant. So it could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. I love this. This is almost like reading Victorian sentences. Like, who else's point of view? Like, what, the ants? The ants are going to be loving it, So he summarised the findings as time is running out. All right, I thought we were the ones who were supposed to be alarmists. Time is running out. But no, Lyndon B. Johnson, 1965, time is running out. Shell and BP begin funding scientific research in Britain to examine the climate impacts from greenhouse gases. And now this is a time before the politics and science have come in. Science has gone very well with, oil exploration, mineral exploration. They have to find out where it is. So they were quite clued up on science. And they, in good nature, or in good faith, went into researching into CO2's effects on the atmosphere. So 1977, 7 years later, I've been in renewable energy integration for 8 years now, so I kind of know what that feels like. You've got a couple of PhD students have gone through, you've got some postdocs, maybe you've got someone's a lecturer. Overwhelming consensus that fossil fuels were responsible for atmospheric carbon dioxide increases. So now we know what's causing it. It's not maybe like, the sea's doing something funny, the volcano's doing something funny, or some other industry. It is fossil fuels. Hey, this is a very colourful one. So Jimmy Carter, this is, paths not taken in world history. So Jimmy Carter put some solar panels on the roof of the White House. And it's a really good speech. I really recommend listening to it, because you can see like a fine mind kind of like plotting out what different paths that the world might take. He was an engineer and also a farmer, as it happened. So will these be an example of a road not taken? They were, yeah. They're museum piece now. Actually, they're a museum piece in China, because China are doing solar. But he says this could be the greatest and most exciting adventure ever undertaken. That's what we propose as well. It's not just all doom and gloom. This will be we are proposing a better world that isn't self-immolating, I guess would be the expression. So he's saying the American people harnessing the power of the sun to enrich our lives. Right. So nice and utopian. That's the system there. 20 grand's worth of solar panels back in 1979. That would cost you about 20 grand now, maybe 30 grand, right? That's solar water heating. And remember, the White House isn't just a house for it's an office. It's a big office. So would have paid for itself in 7 to 10 years, but Ronald Reagan got in and ripped them out. So his fiscal conservatism, which could argue is an ideology, went up against a different ideology. And you saw which one won. So 1981, an Exxon memo warns it is distinctly possible that CO2 emissions from the company's 50-year plan will later produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic, at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. So this is the global south problem. So the people who are going to suffer the most from climate change aren't the people who are most responsible for climate change. And that was being recognized back there. In the 1980s, we're getting serious, we're getting our computers and so on. So 1988, another 7 years on of research. So 1 to 2 degrees warming over the next 40 years. We are 40 years on, well, not quite 40 years on from then. Hope not, otherwise I'm getting a lot older than I think I am. So it's about 30 years on. And we're at 1.1, 1.2, maybe 1.3 we'll hit this year, but we're in this range. And by 40 years, we'll probably, if we're not careful, be at very close to 2. With changes that may be the greatest in recorded history, they are. Like the temperature rise, what we're doing is on a different order of magnitude from what the planet does. This is chilling. By the time global warming becomes detectable, it could be too late to take effective countermeasures to reduce the effects or even stabilize the situation. So we do come across this sort of doomsday a little bit. It's like, it's too late. I've got lots of friends like, why would I even get bothered getting into activism? It's too late. Sure, just order takeaway and sit in my room and play video games. Like, fair enough. It's cool. It's like, but like, when did this happen? Like, when did people become so defeatist? And if it is the end anyway, you might as well have a bit of fun at it. So I'm not sure how much I'm supposed to be joking about this. Yeah. Gallows humor. Anyway, 1989, the US industry so they established in 1989, right, following these damning kind of warnings, they set up, the US industry sets up this global climate coalition. Interesting. A lobbying group that challenges the science on global warming and delays action to reduce emissions. So now we're in the modern era. From 89 forwards. This is what the smoking industry did, very similar stuff. Just deny the science, obfuscate, muddy the waters, delay, dither. And that was starting then. And then, of course, like the rest of them, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP in 1993-94. But so Principle 8 of Extinction Rebellion. So Extinction Rebellion have 3 demands and 10 principles. The principles are how you operate within Extinction Rebellion. Principle 8, we avoid blaming and shaming. We live in a toxic system, but no one individual is to blame. So I like this quote. An ignorant person is inclined to blame others for their own misfortune. To blame oneself is proof of progress, but the wise person never has to blame another or themselves. We waste a lot of time blaming and getting angry and stuff. It's nice to take action, because while you sit around thinking, you're just sort of waiting for depression in some ways. So 1992 Rio Summit, right? This is where the governments of the world are getting together and realizing that this is an issue. And then, you're going to have things coming out of this, like the Kyoto Agreement and stuff like that. George Bush Sr., the US fully intends to be a preeminent world leader in protecting the global environment. It's amazing that, a Republican back then could be so overt about, protecting the environment and so on. So 2013, 90 companies are responsible for producing 2/3 of the carbon. So we're at 91% here, 2/3 of the carbon, 90 companies. This is why personal change is lovely, but we need more than that. We need system change, because we can't affect how these companies operate. Often they're looking for a 2-year payback on energy investments, so they could double their efficiency if they wanted to, but if it doesn't pay back in 2 years, not going to bother making the investment. Just not worth it. They wait for another year and another year and another year. We have, and we're expected to install solar panels with a 7 to 10 to 15 year payback. So, yeah. Anyway, double standards. 2019, I like this quote here. This should be reassuring. So this is the Secretary General of OPEC. We're now at 105% of 2017 levels in 2019. So climate campaigners are the biggest threat to the industry. Yay. We're working hard. They've got their billions of dollars in their private jets. We've got little PowerPoint presentations. And we're misleading the public with unscientific warnings about global warming. So sometimes we will go through bits and bobs and try and convince you of this and that. But what I'm going to stick to today, start of Science Week, is just stuff which is plucked from things like the Paris Agreement, IPCC report, UN reports. So the Paris Agreement's central claim, strengthen global response to climate change, keeping global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue efforts to get it down to 1.5. So that's kind of your overshoot point, and then you're going to settle back down to 1.5. That's what their aim is. That's what they agreed to. Talking 180 or 90 countries. They're not doing this for the love of the environment. They're not tree huggers. All of these people are about making more money, higher productivity, staying in power. They're not interested in environmentalism. They just realize that this is safeguarding their future. This is suicidal to go beyond this. That's why it was chosen. But whenever this came out, we just got these numbers. We weren't told why these numbers were important, or I don't remember hearing why they were not important. But there's also little bits, these are relatively easy to read. So at the end of this, there's this little bit at the end, decision 1, blah, blah, blah. Enhancement of provision of urgent finance, technology and support, and measures to strengthen high-level engagement. I've been working in renewable energy integration for 8 years, as I say. This was 2015, Paris Agreement came in. It's the same. It's the same kind of laissez-faire, bring in the grants, don't worry too much about things. I've not had, admittedly Northern Ireland's a bit different, but politicians are not battering down our doors for solutions. There's not a huge flood of money coming in to renewable energy stuff. It's just kind of it's just kind of footering around with the drapes, We all know what this sort of feels like. But so the IPCC report. These are the type of graphs I'd make if I was allowed to, right? Watercolors. So IPCC report, global warming 1.5 degrees C. That's a graph. See there, isn't that nice? Not good. So just one more time. There we go. So it's a bit busy, right? So cumulative emissions of CO2, future non-CO2, radiative forcing, determining the probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, right? On the bottom, 1960 to 2100. There's us there. And this is observed temperature rise. You can see all these fluctuations. That's them bouncing around, that's temperature. So you can see we've already been above 1.5 degrees C. like back a few years back. That was maybe in an El Nino event or something like this. This is the danger that, you have these little ones that jump up. You can't really predict them, can't really determine them. You could go over the edge. So we need to be a little bit cautious. So looking back, what you're looking at. This is the mean average value, and this is our confidence window. So we can be pretty definitely sure that this temperature rise here is caused. Maybe more and it may be less, right? There's a bit of speculation, but this is error bars. And this is where science sometimes loses out to people who are pseudoscientific, because people like certainty. So if you ask person A that how much effect does CO2 have in the atmosphere, and they say 0, and it's like, what's your error bar? 0. It has 0 effect with 0 uncertainty, right? And then you have another person going, well, we think it's 1.2 degrees plus or minus 0.5, and it's like, well, look, that person doesn't even know what they're talking about. They've got error bars. So that's one of the reasons why bullshitters get ahead, because they don't work with error bars. They're completely sure of what they're saying, or they sound it. So, anyway, this is a bouncing around bit, and these are our 3 scenarios for keeping us under. So this is one scenario. This is a bad scenario. We go up to 2 degrees and we stay at 2 degrees, right? The purple line. This is a blue scenario. That's okay. That's kind of what they're talking about. Well below 2 degrees C, tend them back towards 1.5 by 2100. Right? That's we want to be in this envelope. This envelope's still dangerous. They're not considering too many feedbacks, but this is the main plot in the IPCC summary, executive summary, page 6. Just like, if you're not going to read anything more, just spend a bit of time on this one, the page before and the page after. So then you get 3 more graphs afterwards. We'll knock this one out first, right? You put methane into the atmosphere, it'll go away if you stop putting it in. So that's why it goes up, it peaks, and then falls down. You stop putting it there, it goes away. Half-life is 7 years. Nitrous oxides, they're worse. They're like 100 years to decay and 300 times worse than CO2. But CO2 is the main one, because it's so much of a bulk and it accumulates. It doesn't go away. You're talking thousands of years of a half-life. The only way to get rid of it is through mineral erosion of the likes of chalk and limestone and so on, and making caves. So that's one way of getting rid of it. The other way, of course, is biological. So there we go. Moving on to this plot here. So bear in mind, once we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, it doesn't go away, it stays there, and it stays heating. So a bit like you lying on a bed and someone puts an extra blanket on, and an extra blanket on, and an extra blanket on. It takes a while for the heat to build up. It might take hours, So that's the situation. Every time we add on a little bit more here, it's an extra blanket in the bed. So to stay underneath this grey line, which was sort of agreed is a slightly, I don't want to say psychopathic, this is a very risky line to be on, right? This is a real tightrope line here. This is safer. So to achieve that, the grey line need to be carbon neutral as an entire population of the Earth by 2055. If we want to be sensible, then it's 2040. Right, this is the IPCC report. Right, this isn't some sort of out there think tank or a bunch of. This isn't Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. This is the IPCC report, bringing together all the research that they can. And I actually got that one slightly bigger. So, that's by 2040 as an entire globe. So if we want to be, say, even let's just take somewhere in between 2045, entire globe we want to be carbon neutral by. When do you think Western countries should be carbon neutral by? Do you think we should be carbon neutral by 2045? And then also expect Sudan and India and so on to meet us there, or should maybe we try a little bit harder? Maybe we should aim for 2035 or 2030, and then buy them a little bit of time, seeing as it was mostly us who caused this problem. But yeah, that's what they look like. That's not exactly a bunch of crusties, right? Sort of. They're quite conservative people. A little bit of female representation, which is nice to see. But it's still, these are very conservative people. People in this position, scientists and engineers, are conservative people, diligent, conservative, and they're the ones that are saying we need to be net zero between 2040 and 2055. So now I just invite you to think a little bit more about this 2025 figure, about whether or not how sensible that now seems. Because there's a political reality and there's a scientific reality. It's like, politically, can we do this? Scientifically, is it necessary? Someone tells you you're going to die from smoking, within a year if you don't stop smoking. You're going to stop smoking or just go fuck it. Anyway, so anyway, sorry. And you can draw your own conclusions. Yeah, so there's this here. Have we moved into this? Have I moved into that one? Oh yeah, no, this is so inside, sorry, I would sort of thought I'd skip on to the next bit. Inside the IPCC 2018 report, executive summary, 30 pages, there are all these sorts of little snippets that you can read at your leisure. Don't try and read them quickly. They are very, very packed. It is the executive summary. So, adaptation and mitigation are clearly already occurring, high confidence. Sort of makes sense. Oceans warming, fish are moving, things like that. Future climate-related risks could be reduced by upscaling and accelerating of far-reaching, multi-level and cross-spectral climate mitigation, and by both incremental and transformational adaptation. Right, it's a bit of a mouthful, but everything in there is, what's the word? I don't want to say radical, but everything in there is quite revolutionary. That we have to upscaling, acceleration of far-reaching, multi-level cross-sectoral climate mitigation, right? And also it's on here, incremental is doing things, loft insulation, solar panels, putting on more buses. That's all incremental. Transformational is like your whole system change stuff. So they're saying this, the IPCC are saying this, and so are Extinction Rebellion. It's always a bit funny to be in something seen that actually ends up on the terrorist list, but it's actually just trying to go, you see the IPCC report, would your mind just following through and all that stuff you said you do in Paris Agreement? So, and it's an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore said 15 or more years ago. But anyway, this is a terrifying bit. High latitude tundra and boreal forests are particularly at risk of climate change induced degeneration and loss. Woolly shrubs are already encroaching into the tundra, and this will proceed with further warming. Sorry, sometimes the sentences are badly written and too long, but hopefully you can get to the bottom of it. You wouldn't get away with that in average publication, but so limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees is projected to prevent the thawing over centuries of a permafrost area in the range of 1.5 to 2.5 million kilometres squared. I had to look up that because these numbers are so big. Ireland, anyone with an idea of the size of Ireland? Kilometres squared? About 80,000. The UK is like 260,000. France, 600 odd thousand. Right, so 1.5 to 2.5 million kilometres squared of permafrost. The reason permafrost scares me is this, methyl hydrates. There's more methane stored in ice in permafrost and oceans than there is all of the known and consumed fossil fuels that were burnt thus far. This stuff can melt. If it gets above 11 degrees C, it melts. So yeah, that is the trigger. That's the one that scares me. That's the one that I found out about 15 years ago and went, okay, this is a big deal. And that's what it looks like. These are starting to crop up more often. This is methane gathering together and exploding in Arctic tundra, and mostly in Russia and Canada. So yeah, back to these guys. They wrote the report. So then the next one, the emissions gap report 2019. This came out in November, I think. So once again, executive summary, and they lay it on the ground pretty quick. Paragraph 1, right, provides the latest assessment of scientific studies, just like the IPCC. They don't do their research, they get other people's research and gather it together for you. On current and estimated future greenhouse gas emissions, and compares these with the emissions levels permissible for the world to proceed on the least cost pathway to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it's still least cost that we're on, and it's, so we're still talking capitalism here, right? It's less costly to fix the roof than it is to rebuild the house. It's kind of the argument. So the difference between where we are likely to be and where we need to be has become known as the emissions gap. That's where they get it from. So we're falling behind our commitments, and they quantify it for us. Paragraph 3, right, the summary findings are bleak. They're not messing around here. Like, these people are staring at the science. It's terrifying them. We're failing to meet our targets. However, there is a differentiated message emerges, so there are some signs of hope. A number of encouraging developments have taken place, and with the political focus on the climate crisis, and so on. So it likes off Extinction Rebellion, Greta, you strikers, right? These guys who are writing these reports, big UN guys, one of the few places they can find solace is in people being disruptive and trying to drive this up the agenda, because they know the consequences. A few people glued to trains is nothing in comparison to what's happening. So in addition, also we have the technologies. They're there. We're just not investing. They're just not taking a long-term vision. So they're happy that, advancements in technology, but not in the actual distribution. Paragraph 4, still in the introduction. So focus on how to create transformational change and just transitions. I thought, Extinction Rebellion, it was only really with Extinction Rebellion I first started just transitions, but turns out not. The UN are pretty serious about it as well, or the UN emissions gap. And also now they've stopped talking about incremental change, it's just transformational change. So overall conclusion, there we go, I skipped ahead. Overall conclusion, incremental changes will not be enough, and there is a need for rapid and transformational action. Act now, right, that's demand 2 of Extinction Rebellion. So coming from the UN. Skipping ahead to paragraph 7, we're still in the introduction. You don't have to go far into these reports, right, to really kind of get to the guts of the matter here. A key aim of the summit was to secure commitment from countries to enhance their, these NDCs, I can't remember what, basically it's both their emissions and their reporting of emissions of CO2. So it was met with some extent, but mostly smaller countries. G20 members were visibly absent. So yeah, we might be sort of, rich people in rich countries who can get away with protesting, but our governments aren't even being bothered to go to the table. You can possibly see us a wee bit now with upcoming, COP26, or in the fact that nobody wants to even chair it. It is a poison chalice at the end of the day. You have to sit there, pretend like you care, and then do nothing. I think that's kind of what, asking David Cameron to chair it, he's like, I'm not being your fall guy. And what minister is going to sit there and do it? So that's the level of concern that's been granted to these issues. So, so we're into section 1. Gas to the right. So there is no sign of greenhouse gas emissions peaking in the next few years. Every year postponed peaking means that deeper and faster cuts will be required. This is a thing. It's like the sooner we start, the less painful it's going to be. Yeah, it's going to be, well, it doesn't even need to be that. It will be painful, but there's also nice things for not driving cars, for instance, so it's not just about not driving cars. But these people are starting to getting pretty bleak. So you got our descent plans anyway, so this one's a little bit more nuanced than the previous, so you had a year and a half to work on it. So you're getting from up here down to there. That's our 1.5 degrees, our not crazy descent plan. Halving our emissions in 10 years requires a 7% per year drop in emissions. If we're talking about globally, then maybe we're going to start talking about Western countries looking at 10% per year drop in emissions. That's recession level, like Great Recession, or even like the recession in Ireland level of reduction in CO2 emissions or energy consumption. It's slightly terrifying, but that's what, if we do it in a controlled measure, it should be a lot better. But that's what we're looking at. And not for, as I say, not just to be nice, to save ourselves. And then of course the 2 degree range, much less optimistic, but still very difficult. And probably most of this sort of would need to come from Western countries because we are the largest emitters as well. China's up there, but big population, and they are actually working quite hard. And so you can see here, 2005, that's where we would have been. This is a lot like the plots you'll see about CFCs, actually, because this is how they brought it in. They kind of had one agreement that would have left them here. They have another agreement that leaves them here. This is actually with their unconditional NDCs. This is with the conditional NDCs. So you can see, even with implementing what they are asking, it's still only, once again, food with the drapes. We have to get much harder. We have to work much harder. This is the emissions gap they're talking about. This is the unfortunate reality. So often people ask us, so Extinction Rebellion aren't a solutions-based organisation, we're a pressure group, right? So people often derail a conversation by saying, what will you do? Because often they're asking you, what are you telling me to do? You tell me to drive less, and then once someone says that, it's like, fuck off. I know. Nobody likes to be told what to do. If your boss tells you to do something, there's a natural pushback, even if it's your own best interests. But so XR aren't a solutions organisation, they're a pressure group. Implement these, they're there. These guys are much better. These guys are paid to do this, we aren't, right? I do work in renewable energy integration, so I'll give you some ideas about like wind integration and all that sort of stuff, but don't ask me about transport. So they've got all these recommendations. Argentina, reallocate fossil fuel subsidies to support distributed renewable electricity generation. Cool, That's their thing. Brazil, a bit different. Stop burning down your rainforests. No. Promote the urban agenda by increasing the use of public transport and other low carbon alternatives. Great. China, continue governmental support. Great. Further support. Because China aren't quite as crazy when it comes to this. They're a different beast. And then also promote near zero emission building development and integrate into government planning. So this is a big deal for us as well. European Union, adopt an EU regulation to refrain from investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, including new natural gas pipelines. Take Northern Ireland, gas to the west. They're only finishing that project. How long will it be in place for? How long can we use gas for in this country? Maybe 10 years? Why did they bother? I don't know, maybe they did want to frack for mana after all, and that was their plan to get the gas out. Anyway, so this is, we're investing in this. Also, Cloughan Point, or no to Cloughan Point, they're talking about putting in, spend 11 million developing a pipeline to bring particularly diesel and so on in for the Go filling stations. Right. That money could be spent elsewhere. That's the argument. Step up efforts to phase out coal-fired power plants. That's happening. Got Kilroot Power Station out there. Should have been closed down about 5 years ago, but we need it for security of voltage stability. Just something I know about, but it's not necessarily something that other people need to. So shift towards increased use of public transport in line with the most ambitious member states. The glider doesn't exactly cut it when you're comparing it to like the likes of Germany and the Netherlands.
Bristol's got some cool buses. They've got the poo buses. They run on excrement.
You just have to lift up the seat and then.
Copenhagen.
All right, yeah. So that's the thing. That's transformational. It's not just getting a new bus. It's like you're actually transforming your whole economy and way of doing things and making it circular and so on. Increase the renovation rate for intensive retrofits of existing buildings. I mean, most people know about the housing stock in Belfast. Not great. And even the new builds, pretty dire. There's still, I don't know if insulation standards have moved in the last 15 years. 100 mil of Kingspan, could be 300 mil. Make an unbelievable amount of difference, not least over the course of 50 or 100 years. But no, we're still what's the cheapest? How cheaply can I build that house? That's the only thing they're thinking about. And get out the door. You'd not believe I just bought a house back in September. You'd not believe the corners this guy cut. Anyway, so. As long as it looks nice on the outside, right, and it's painted in a not beige colour, yeah. So USA also a bit of a problem child. Implement clean building standards so that all new buildings are 100% electrified by 2030. Right, that's and there are other recommendations as well. But I mean, it does seem willfully optimistic sometimes now, especially when you visit America and see what the crack is. So this is my final slide. This is you can see how much CO2 is put into the atmosphere to make these various raw materials. So iron and steel, and cement, it's probably a bit over 50% of our consumption. That's mostly construction. But we can also look here at, things we buy. Right, so construction, machinery, blah, 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 final use. That's about 7%. 7% of the CO2 is final use. You have control over this. You don't really have control over this, which is why we need system change, right? So that's the argument. So yes, personal change is good. It's a good place to start, but it's a bad place to finish. That's why you might be a vegan and you might be completely off-grid and everything else. But, it's still not going to solve the problem. If everyone did it, yeah, it would be a lot better. But that's not what's happening. And that's not the only fruit available. It's not, the low-hanging fruit. Anyway, that's where we live. And we ain't got anywhere else. So,
my name is Colin. I'm a lecturer in biology at Queen's University, and I thought, so my main interest in my main area of research is actually genetics, and I use the fly to understand mostly kind of behavior and physiology of flies, and aging in particular, and sex-specific behaviors. So I'm not necessarily biodiversity focused, but I do teach a lot of biodiversity, and my background kind of includes quite a bit of biodiversity, and I work with other biodiversity scientists and researchers in my position, so I thought I could give a little bit about my interpretation of some of the reports that Paul touched on earlier, and to think about the impact of what Paul was talking about and the changes in greenhouse gas emissions and what that means basically towards us and towards the ecosystem that we share the natural world with. So, as I said, Paul was kind of half the story in terms of looking at the physical aspects of the world and thinking about our actual atmosphere and what that means for our temperature, sea rises, etc. And now I kind of wanted to have a wee look at the biodiversity and how that's changed over human history and through the Anthropocene era of the Earth. So this is a really horrible image. So this is the world about 10,000 years ago. So this is kind of like Stone Age man kind of style time. Oops, that went away. Okay. And you can see here that the wild animal biomass, so this is mammalian biomass, is 99% wild, while humans only made up about 1% of that biomass. Goes now to like today, the current world, we make up more than a third of the mammalian biomass now on the planet. And we've manipulated the other 64% pretty much to meet our needs as individuals, as our wants and desires as individuals. We've completely reshaped the world like we've never seen before in terms of life and biology, biolife, to completely meet whatever we want the world to look like. We say we want in the short term, not necessarily in the long term. So now we only have about 4% of wild animals. The rest, most of it is 60% livestock, and that also includes pets in that as well. So that's kind of completely manipulating the world. So you can kind of see how drastically we've changed it. But what does this actually mean? So Paul was talking about the IPCC earlier, the International Panel on Climate Change, so the really boring white people in suits. It's like the line of people. There is a separate organization which is newer, which is known as the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short. And so they're separate to the IPCC, but they report to the IPCC specifically on biodiversity and specifically on how the natural world responds to climate change, and how the natural world feeds into our human society as well, and our needs of human society. So they came up with their newest report and presented that to the UN Climate Change Summit back in Paris last year. So it was around May time. And in their reports, they give 4 key messages towards. The first one was that nature was fundamental to human society, and we completely depend on nature in a variety of ways, and it's declining, not surprisingly. I'll come on to each of these 4 points in much greater detail. Their findings showed that there was declining much faster in the last 50 years than it have ever been before. So we're seeing huge changes in mammalian biomass, as you've seen, but also in terms of the ecosystems which are out there. Then that we can't be sustainable by 2030, which is what a lot of the other reports from the IPCC were showing, if we continue the trajectory that we're on in terms of a global Earth, and that we need drastic change. And again, this is not Extinction Rebellion saying this. This is a bunch of kind of business people, basically. But there was elements of hope in this. And they thought that there were elements already shown within human society in different populations across the world. And again, they dwell a lot on Indigenous people and the care that Indigenous people have for the land and the knowledge that they have for repairing the land and for caring for their land that we can take from and that we can kind of use those practices and use those philosophies to completely transform the way that we deal with nature and that we think about nature, and that we use that in our global economy kind of looking forward. But we have to act urgently on this and try to integrate as many of those principles as possible into those. So I want to spend a little bit of time on each of those 4 messages. We can think about to kind of break those down a little bit further. So the first one is nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services are deteriorating worldwide. So just a few points on what this kind of means. First of all, is that we completely depend on nature, and the systems aren't replaceable. Can anyone think of a biological system that might not be replaceable, that we hear quite often about in the news? Bees, yes. So bees are a huge pollinator and pollinate about 70% of our agricultural crops that we depend on. There's currently no other system that can replace bees. And so with the huge decrease in bee populations currently, that's a huge risk to our way of life and the way of life that we've become used to through agricultural practices. We don't. There's tons of research, and there has been tons of research in the last 20 years or so on bees and trying to figure out why they're declining at the rate that they are. We seem to think that there's multiple factors involved, and we think that climate change is impacting pretty much all of those factors. There's an increase in certain mite populations, which are kind of inhabit on bees. There's also a virus going around, and you might hear there's been a lot of tabloid headlines which have talked about the mites and have talked about the viruses and talked about impacts also of like masts and things like that, which can completely disorientate the bees in terms of them homing back to the hive and their ability to find food. Because the more and more we study about them, the more we realize about their complex behavior and that they can communicate with each other in ways that we didn't think possible before. Through they kind of do this cool dancing system, they kind of communicate with each other through acoustic signals. But it's not just bees, it's other aspects of the ecosystem, such as the wetlands. Obviously, that's really a big part of that as well. Although the production has increased in worldwide because we've been trading more in terms of the livestock and plant production, we're now seeing problems in the world where this has been driven for the last, 50, 60, 70 years, but we're now seeing the world kind of reaching breaking point and saying no more. We're seeing actually reduction in our produce globally, but in specific regions, more so than others. But we're seeing that we're kind of reaching the ability that we can get out of the earth into producing the amount that we want as a human species and that we've become accustomed to. Because now we're seeing the developing world wanting to catch up with us and wanting to have the lifestyles that we have. And so the resource demands are much greater on the earth, but we're not seeing the production increase with that, even though we want to, and even though there's money involved in that. The biggest thing about this report, and that's highlighted in this report in terms of the risk to biodiversity, is land use and how the land has been treated in the world the last 100 years or so. They're saying that 75% of the land has been substantially altered, and that means that we've completely changed what was, like, let's say, ancient woodlands or wetlands or whatever, and completely converted it to what we need it to be. Most of that is either habitable land for ourselves, but the majority is actually changing the land to feed livestock. And that's where we see the burning of the Amazons and the destruction of rainforests, especially in Indonesia, when they burn all those and Borneo, when they burn all the rainforests there to plant soya for the livestock that we feed to get us meat. So this complete land use or reuse kind of changes the biodiversity, which usually exists there, completely destroys the ecosystems, and that not just has an impact on the 75% of the land, but also changes the ecosystems on the other parts of the ecosystems that we live on. Quite drastically, they see that the extinction rate is actually 10 to 100 times faster than it's been in the last 10 million years on average. That has not necessarily just been to do with climate change, it's also to do with human activity. So us completely destroying ecosystems and building on them instead. What was that cartoon that people used to watch with the animals of Farthingwood? Remember that one? When we built the road and the hedgehogs keep trying to cross the road. So I mean, that has had a huge impact in the biodiversity that we see in habitable lands within the last hundreds of thousands of years. But more so now we're seeing the impact of climate change and the breakdown of ecosystems from a fundamental level. A huge impact as well is, and one that the report really strongly shows upon that we don't really think about too much, is whenever we're taking over those lands, we're taking over those ecosystems, and even whenever we're trying to replenish certain ecosystems, like trying to replenish ancient woodlands, we try to use plants which we think are the most efficient. So the plants which will grow the fastest when we're trying to build trees, we're trying to plant trees which will absorb the most carbon dioxide. That's still replenishing what used to be quite a diverse ecosystem with a monoculture. So what that means is just kind of a single species of tree or a single species of plant. And that's not healthy. That doesn't lead to a sustainable ecosystem. That's our kind of very monoculture, I would say monoculture brain, but like our very single focused brain and short-term thinking brain, thinking about how can we repair this? Let's stick like a plaster on this. That's not going to lead to a sustainable ecosystem that provides resources for multiple species and allows us to live in a sustainable planet. So we have to be smart about how we think about that. And also we're seeing, interesting from my perspective, because I look at evolutionary gene changes, we've seen organisms have to adapt at a much greater level than we've ever seen them having to adapt before. So, I mean, I work in a lab with flies, and we can get flies to artificially evolve in very kind of strange conditions to show how genes respond to mad environmental changes. But we're actually seeing that within nature as well, not just within the lab. But we're seeing, I mean, a really famous one is the pepper moth, or the kind of the Darwin's moth. Whenever it evolved to respond to the soot on the trees and became much darker, because then the birds wouldn't be able to find the moths if they were black, because the soot on the trees was black, and so they were able to hide and camouflage themselves against the trees. Like, that level of evolution occurred over the Industrial Revolution, but color change in insects doesn't occur over decades. It occurs usually over thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. So we're seeing this industrial action, how we're shaping the world, actually having a huge response on the organisms that we have, and a much faster response in their adaptation, but not in a sustainable way. With one species evolving faster, the other parts of the ecosystem can't evolve that quickly. Evolution depends on the life cycle of the individual. Flies have a life cycle of about 2 weeks. Obviously, humans have a much longer life cycle. Trees have a really much greater life cycle. So every part of the ecosystem has evolved over millions and billions of years to kind of become in sync with each other, and we're completely dysregulating that synchronicity. And that's something we have to be quite concerned about, and thinking about the impacts of that in the future as well. So this is a diagram that they have from this part of the section, from the key point A. And it's just what I want to kind of highlight here is the different ecosystems that we have. So it's usually broken down into terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. So the marine ecosystem makes up about 2/3 of the world's surface, but it's probably one we don't really hear about that often. But the most important thing I want to bring in here is the impact of land or sea use. So again, we're actually taking parts of the sea and using that either as our pollutant reservoir, unfortunately, or as specific fisheries, or taking over the sea for our own uses, as maybe oil reserves as well. Same with freshwater. And so it was just actually our impact in terms of taking over the land is quite dramatic. But as well as that, you can see the effect of pollution on these individual ecosystems, and actually how climate change is actually not that great. Everyone keeps banging on about climate change, thinking that's going to impact about 80% of our ecosystem. It's actually mostly our land use and how we're actually dealing with the land right now. And climate change currently doesn't have so much of an impact that we would usually be led to believe. These are some interesting statistics which have been brought out from the report. One of the biggest ones, obviously, I'm kind of dealing with here is the idea that 25% of species are already threatened with extinction at this point of current level. That's across all different groups of animals and plants. So from mammals to amphibians to dicots and kind of important species that we depend on in our existence. Our biggest one is amphibians. So amphibians and birds are actually quite drastically overrepresented here in this extinction list. As well as that, so we can see, so this kind of relates to my initial point, looking at how we've changed the mammalian biomass of the planet to meet our needs and our desires as human beings. So we can see actually the global biomass of wild mammals has actually decreased by 82%, even just since the 70s. So that's something that's, when you kind of look at David Attenborough and you think about the nostalgic elements of kind of looking at safaris and rainforests, it's something kind of strike the public. And then I think something I'll come on to later, I hope, thinking about indigenous people, actually the land, the rate of deterioration of the ecosystems for indigenous populations is much slower than the rest of the world, and they've actually shown a lot more initiatives in caring for the land that they live on rather than the rest of us, and so I think we can take a lot of lessons from indigenous people. And the problem is they're the ones who are actually facing the biggest changes in climate change. They're the ones who are actually going to have to deal with the biggest impacts and not have the resources available to defend themselves against the implications of climate change. On to B then. That's it's a bit confusing, but direct and indirect drivers of change has accelerated over the past 50 years, but basically just saying that climate change has really taken into effect in the last years. As I said before, that the land use is the biggest contributor to that, rather than climate change itself necessarily. But there was a huge focus on pollution. And the effects of pollution, especially in the last 10 years or so, that we've seen in all ecosystems, so terrestrial, freshwater, and marine. Also, with global trade, with global movement, it's usually put in a very, very positive light, which, I mean, it is. There's a lot of benefits to having a global society and having lots of movement. But I think we also have to consider the implications that might bring to our way of life and to the nature that we share this planet with. And actually, a lot of the biggest risks that we have to a lot of the to our ecosystems is actually the introduction of foreign and alien species to our ecosystems, known as invasive species. So we already seen what the really famous one is the one in Australia, the toad. I can't remember what it's called. Yes, the cane toad going to Australia. It was introduced. I don't even know when it was introduced, but it completely wiped out a lot of the native species and completely disrupted the ecosystem, which again had kind of found this nice synchronicity over millions of years, and it just kind of came and destroyed it in a matter of a decade, basically. Unfortunately, with the plastic, with the pollutions as well, and with a big focus around sea plastic currently, there's 10 times more sea plastic in the oceans now than there was even in the 80s, which is just shocking, actually, I think, when you think about that. Because the sea is out of sight, out of mind, and we don't really think about that much. So it's not something we can think of. As well as that, the biggest, one of the biggest elements of the report, and we'll come on to this when we're thinking about transition, is their concern about our short-term thinking in terms of global growth. So we've grown as a population. We've kind of doubled in the last 50 years as a population. Our economy has grown. Our economy has grown about 4 times, and our global trade has grown even at 10 times that. But that's completely not sustainable. I mean, this is, and then the population growth, the ones who kind of like just come into existence, they want to have the life that we have. I mean, with globalization comes the spread of information, and the capitalist culture has created this pinnacle of a life, right? So that we're kind of consumers. And now, if you go to any part of the world, that's pretty much the aim. For them. So we need to kind of try to curb that as much as possible. And the support is showing that this is just completely not sustainable and it's going to drive us off the cliff, essentially. Economy values, this is part of this, economy values profit over ecosystem. So, through initiatives, but there has been successes, I think, this as well. So although our economy does promote profit because we want to see global trade and all of our strategic development goals as a world basically is to grow the city. I mean, we see that in Belfast, right? I mean, they want to grow the city, I think 4 times the population or something like this by 2050 or something is the plan. Yeah, they want to develop the east and the west. They want to introduce new industries, which are going to cost a lot of resources and fossil-based resources. And every city wants to do that, obviously. Look at China building all the cities constantly. They're not sustainable. And that's not a sustainable look at how we should be growing as a world. But there are successful initiatives that we see out there which both benefit social systems, ecosystems, and economic systems. They might not be as fast growing as needing 2 years worth of profit, to kind of get profits margin. But if you think about it in the long term, and I think that's what we need to kind of focus on, we can get to an economic growth, just not as fast. And a more fair and just growth, which I think is what we're going to come on to as well. Again, the focus on indigenous managed land is having a slower rate of decline. And they seem to manage about 25% of the land mass that we have. Here is a horrendous graph looking at some of the GDP in the world. So the world is this dotted line here. This blue, I'm colorblind, but I think this is blue in the developed world. And the developing world is this other color, beige, which you know. So you can see the GDP has gone up, even from the 70s. I mean, the 70s is really where kind of people started trading, but this is already known. We already knew from the 70s that it was fossil fuels that were causing the increase in greenhouse gas and was becoming unsustainable system. So we knew that from the 70s, and you can see already that our GDP is increased as a world 4 times within that period. You can see that domestic material consumption actually is increasing. Significantly in the developed world, it's just insanely higher than the developing world. But as the developing world becomes more developed, you can see kind of where they want to be. So that's kind of concerning, that gap. The extraction of living biomass as well. So again, this is to meet our trade demands. And this is completely not sustainable, but you can see the developing world wanting to catch up where we were during the Industrial Revolution, but catching up to where we were given the population that they have, which is just insane because we have a much smaller population than they do. So so it's kind of concerning. Certain things about air pollution, you can see in the world that the air pollution is actually kind of decreasing, but this is very regional. So if you can think about, like, if you see the clouds of smog that go over like Indonesia, Singapore, Hong Kong, that's concerning, and we know that there's an increasing number of deaths every year related to air pollutants and the bioaccumulation of those pollutants and toxins in our society. On to C, quite a long one. Basically they're saying that the goals for trying to preserve nature at its current trajectories is completely unsustainable. The goals for 2030 and beyond may only be achievable through transformative changes across economic, social, technological factors. So the progress that we've made, especially within the developed world, has been successful. It has been not successful, has been progress, but it's too slow. Trying to fit everything within our current trajectory of capitalism and trying to make things green, but still kind of going towards this increase in GDP that we're used to since the 70s. That's just not sustainable. And even this kind of very conservative group of individuals says that we need transformative change in order to do that. I must look what this is, but I didn't see what actually biodiversity targets. So this is a report that they gave obviously last year to the Paris Climate Change. They said that the vast majority, 80% of the targets were going to be missed in this biodiversity target. I'm not sure when they were set, but that was the biggest effort to try to preserve biodiversity in the world. They said that ecosystem loss, so this is the loss of, say, bees or the loss of other kind of aspects of our ecosystem that we rely on, actually undermines about 80% of the strategic development goals of the UN, the sustainability development goals even. And so these are the goals of trying to reduce poverty, trying to ensure that hunger doesn't exist in the world by 2050, trying to ensure that pollution is reduced and that people are living healthily. So this is like basically the Human Rights Act, but for the planet, basically, trying to keep the planet healthy, that our ecosystem loss is actually going to undermine 80% of those goals, so whatever that is. I think it was 40-something goals and 35 of them can't be realized without our focus on the ecosystem and the replenishment, not even the stopping of the impact of the ecosystem, but actually the replacement or the regeneration of the ecosystem. Obviously, the biggest impact of climate change is going to be in the world's poorest. So we see that in Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines. Those are where we see the tsunamis occurring, and we see the biggest impacts of climate change. And they have nowhere to go. No one's going to take them. We've seen that with the refugee crisis that we've been having over the last 10 years. No country wants to take them, and we're going to get into a point of us versus them, really, if we continue the trajectory that we want. If we do not have any sort of transformative change in the next 10 years or so, the negative impact is going to continue until well past the 2050s, even with our very kind of our green impacts and our green deals. Without transformative change, we're not going to get anywhere really by 2050, and that's whenever we're already locked into very, very dangerous forms of climate change and the temperature changes. And they reiterate that all future goals taken by every country involved in this pact need to take into account the existing and predicted effects of climate change, not just for each own country, but thinking it from a very holistic sense as well, and trying to create more of a fostering kind of holistic view of the world as a whole, rather than individual's country kind of caring about its GDP, but thinking about our impact globally. And so here is a really depressing table on the goal and the target of these sustainability goals as a planet. And this is kind of where the targets of the Aichi that were developed, and you can see where this kind of panel, this IPBES panel, has decided where we are in terms of poor, immediate, or good. And you can see we're just poor pretty much in most of them. So we were hoping to say have this kind of use within sustainable limits, kind of make sure that habitat loss is at least half. We're not getting anywhere close to these. I mean, we're completely failing in every regards of our biodiversity. And again, our biodiversity loss and our ecosystem loss undermines all the other sustainable development goals that we hope to achieve as a world by 2050. So without putting this at the forefront and putting our ecosystem at the forefront, we're never going to be able to reach a world where we really want to be. But there is some hope, perhaps. A major issue, and actually quite a large, a substantial part of the document is actually dedicated towards having a positive aspect of the future and thinking how we, coming up with ideas of how we can code together as a human species, thinking how we can preserve our ecosystems and actually replenish the ecosystems that we have. So they think that we can actually restore some of our nature by using sustainability. If we have urgent and concentrated efforts as a collective. So they're saying that we have to have this combined international action rather than, again, thinking individual countries thinking about their own initiatives or thinking about their own GDP. That we need to have some sort of global efforts in doing so. They highlight saying that where we've got to currently is a very short-term focus from the world, and it's never really looking at we kind of think that we've ended up in a very unequal society and a very unequal global ecosystem, not through trying to get there, but I think just through the natural processes of being a human being and being quite greedy and loving loving our individuals closest to us. We want to care for them the most, and we give them our resources, and that divides the inequality even further and even further. And again, having the 90 businesses contributing contributing most to our greenhouse gas emissions, they just want to see profit, and everything's just very short-minded or short-sighted. This is one point again. What they're saying is that if we it's very difficult to change that in the current ecosystem, the current global system that we find ourselves in. And the best and the most likely chance that we have to lead to a sustainable ecosystem is to encourage a just transition from that, to show that we can actually have a more equal society in all levels across the world. So that we can think of it less from a local perspective and think more of a global perspective, thinking how can we get the most vulnerable, unequal individuals a chance to have more equal chances in the world, and how can we reduce our privilege and try to pass that privilege on to other individuals and to use that transformation to create a more sustainable ecosystem and a more sustainable society. So they say that most people in the world would be up for that because most people in the world are unequal currently, and on the lower side of that spectrum. So they're saying for a proper change to occur, it should be a just transition, and there should be more support for that. And as a most likely outcome is to promote a just transition. They do say, although it needs to have a global challenge, they do recognize that challenges are going to be unique to each region of the world, and they took quite a lot in detail about the developed versus the underdeveloped world. I think that we are the ones that should be changing that lifestyle focus from having a consumerist, materialistic lifestyle, and trying to show that we try to make the most efforts from a developed perspective to try to become carbon neutral. And hoping then that the developed countries will follow that pattern, and to reach a carbon neutral world by 2050. And again, it involves promoting equality in that as well. They talk a lot about using native species and using the knowledge that indigenous people have generated over centuries and the practices that they've developed over the millennia to understand how to preserve the agriculture effectively and actually how to continue agricultural practices but make them sustainable and using the practices that they've developed, because again they've kind of synchronized themselves with the nature that they've evolved in, and it's only really through the agricultural revolution that we've completely taken advantage of that and said, oh, you're not producing enough, so we're going to teach you how to produce crops more effectively, or we're going to teach you how to produce better beef. But we did need to go back and actually think about how can we make our agricultural practices much more sustainable, and how we use the knowledge of the indigenous people, because the indigenous people are the ones who are having the biggest impact from climate change. They're the most likely human populations to become extinct through climate change, and so we're going to lose that knowledge the quickest. And our knowledge is going to be, we can just continue farming the way we do. They do talk a lot about the green infrastructures in cities, and they've shown some really good successes of this. Even some cities in the Middle East have come up with quite green cities, and in China as well, a lot of the new cities that they've developed are close to carbon neutral, and so they want to take those practices and try to implement them in the cities going forward, especially as we are kind of growing as a world towards city living. And the kind of focal points of industry and of the job markets are in the cities. So they want to make the cities much more green friendly. I don't think that's effective. And they have this quote as to build a global sustainable economy, steering away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. I think it just kind of highlights, even from a non-hippie perspective, that our current wet method is just completely unsustainable, and that we need to kind of rethinking. Professor John Barry at Queen's University he's a green politics professor, and he keeps saying, is this really going to be the end where we can't see past capitalism? Is this really the fate of humanity? Is that we're so short-sighted that we can't think of an alternative to capitalism and save ourselves? Easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, and I think that's such a sad state of affairs, if that's true, So I don't want that to be the case. So they, in their chapter then, that they identify certain leverage points that they think that multiple countries can act towards. So kind of incentives and capacity building, cross-sectional cooperation. So again, thinking about other people and not stop having these kind of short-sighted terms and these short-sighted aims and objectives. Having preemptive action, again, kind of stop being so short-sighted. And kind of environmental law and implementation. Using these focuses to affect these leverage points. So their kind of important one was kind of reducing inequalities, again, because you'd have more support from that from a global perspective. Practice justice and inclusion and conversation, so making sure everyone's on board with this. Although doing it quickly, because we haven't got time to ask everyone's perspective. Ensure environmentally friendly technologies, innovation and investment. And we do have a lot, we're seeing a lot of environmentally friendly technologies being developed, especially in the developed world. And we can use those effectively, and we should be using those more effectively later on, and especially promoting education and awareness, which is one of the aims of this organization, actually, is to increase awareness. So if you have these countries kind of with this focus, working on these issues, they can hopefully kind of reduce the effects of overall climate change, which, again, as I was kind of saying, is caused mostly by kind of land use and sea use, as well as pollution and climate change and the impacts of invasive species. So we can kind of tackle these human activities to try to circumvent the impacts of climate change and actually replenish some of the land that we have there to create a more effective, sustainable, happier society that looks at well-being rather than profit. And well-being of not just human species, but all species in general, because we need them for our own development and our own survival. So that just leaves me to, if you want to have some time for reflection, or if you want to kind of go on and give a talk, I don't really, whatever you feel fills the room. Yeah.
So what I'm going to talk to you about just this evening is actually Extinction Rebellion, and a little bit more about the organization, the context, the background, and really bringing it back to, there's a reason why each and every one of you have come tonight, whether it's out of curiosity, whether it's out of concern, whether it's out of a desire, to be more active and to grow and be part of the movement. But we'll be delighted to hear from you later, just in terms of what your own personal drivers are in regards to Extinction Rebellion. But I suppose just to give some of the key principles in terms of how the movement works, because we are a global movement, but obviously building locally. And one of the big pivots, and a lot of you will know all the different stories from the news. I mean, Paul, you mentioned earlier, which always I brought a smile of disbelief to my face when I opened the newspaper that time and it was on the counter-terrorism list. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it. But a whole philosophy behind the organisation, and it comes following a very noble tradition right throughout the 20th and 21st century and way before then. And it is following in the footsteps of what would be known as civil disobedience, civil action, except in the context of Extinction Rebellion. It is called NVDA, Non-Violent Direct Action. And why is there a focus on civil disobedience? Well, do you know what I think when you hear about people signing petitions, sending emails? You know the classic clicktivism? The type of systemic failure that Colin and Paul have highlighted. I mean, surely, I don't know what kind of emotional impact it had on you, but when you listen, it kind of really puts in stark contrast, that sending an email just isn't going to cut it. Quite simply, as an individual, because unfortunately it's one of those spin-offs from neoliberalism and capitalism, is this atomization, as Paul, as you highlighted, the focus on the individual, that I am composting, that I am taking the bus, that I am, and it's almost lauded as that's enough. But actually, it's not enough, because as you've seen, when you take a step back and you zoom out, this is systemic. And it cannot be as much, as Paul highlighted, as much as laudable it is and we feel good doing small individual actions, it requires much, much more. But it also requires people to stop and take notice, because that demands disruption. And that demands citizens stepping up and breaking the law, like in history with any type of systemic change, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's Gandhi, whether it's Martin Luther King standing on the steps of Capitol Hill. To build any momentum for societal transformation or radical action, and all of this that we heard tonight requires radical action. It requires a critical mass of people, and it also requires systems to stop and take notice when law-abiding citizens collectively across the country decide that no longer it is time for words, but it's time for action, and they start breaking the law and doing acts of civil disobedience, but in a non-violent, peaceful manner. That's what gets you noticed. I mean, do you remember all the pictures from last year about the road blockages in London? And again, taking a systems view and looking at the capitalist system, because it is an ideology, but the capitalist system that we're in, it is only sustained non-violent direct actions such as that, where you block off economic arteries. Then people feel, because you can go, and you know what, you can go and have a march up to Stormont, you can go and write thousands and thousands and thousands of emails, you can go and organise a poll. That's all very well and good. You'll get a license to do it, people will kind of look at you, MLAs, go, that's a feel-good thing. It's a very, very different scenario if we built a critical mass and you blocked off all the arterial routes into Belfast. That's when people stop. And part of that is the ethos of non-violent direct action. And another thing, I suppose, really linking to that is, because I laughed when friends of mine were talking to me, and I said, because I have just recently joined after one of Paul and Colin's talks last year, Extinction Rebellion. And it was interesting what my friend said. She goes, is that crowd with the super glue? And as you've noticed, there are no cartoon Acme-sized vats of super glue anywhere in the building. And then the second thing, she said, it was like, do you have to prepare to be arrested to join them? Everybody talks about you always have to be arrested. Part of the action of Extinction Rebellion is, yes, arrestable offences, but there is also a very clear culture for anybody who wants to be involved, because people feel very strongly that they want to go out and do an action, because actions are mass critical actions where people get together and they do something which will capture the imagination, they do something which is disruptive. And oftentimes that's not just blocking roads, but it's also doing something very beautiful. It's also doing something very creative. I mean, Helen, who was here earlier, I was speaking to her, she was talking about bringing her granddaughter, and she went with her daughter and her son-in-law in London, and they repeatedly did a series of actions with Extinction Rebellion. And she told me about, and just following on from the diversity, Colin, about the bees, she said, you know, it was a very joyous thing, but having a critical mass of people congregate in London outside Buckingham Palace. She was there with her daughter, had made her own costume, you know, dressed up as a bee with tights over a coat hanger and stripy socks and everything. But she said, again, the fact that you are surrounded and connected by a huge number of people doing an action, but which is accessible and in a way which everybody can send a message, which is visual, and people feel as if they're doing something. So that just gives you a flavour, you know, in terms of actions and in terms of, yes, there is a very specific process, and I'll come on to talk about that in a moment, and the type of support you get joining Extinction Rebellion, because as Paul highlighted, it is a pressure group. It is not a group which tells you what to do, a didactic, here's what you're going to do and here's what you sign up for. There's a huge amount of freedom around it, but there is also a huge amount of support, and you can clearly define joining the group if you are a personal situation where you want to be arrested or not, basically, or whether you can be. And it is, I just want to bust that myth, because it's something a lot of people have in their heads of storming, being arrested, etc., and that's part of the deal. It's not, but you make a personal choice. And in terms of the ethos of, you know, really, in addition to nonviolent direct action, disruptive action, I also mentioned in terms of the creativity and Extinction Rebellion being what I would see as, and that's what drew me to it, because it was something different, and it actually reflects the values of a lot of the societal changes that actually Colin talked about there before we ended, in terms of changing the conversation, very simply, to moving it away from working for systems which are constantly pushing growth, constantly pushing excess, and also as well, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel as an individual, you know, when you look and you take a step back at your life, or you're at the end of the day, absolutely exhausted. It's overwhelming, it's frenetic, it's hectic. And you just stand back and do you ever wonder a day and you go, what was my day about? What did I do? What did I contribute? Did I live anything I wanted to live? And it seems like a blur. And part of the support in Extinction Rebellion is actually living out those values and changing the conversation about the system in terms of how we go back and how we capture what really matters in terms of diversity, but actually making systems work for human beings. And Colin referred to, you know, the impact, etc., of inequality right across, global inequality. I don't need to tell you, all of us here know that. But actually closer to home, the impact in terms of neoliberal systems on our mental health, where we are living in a society which is constantly pitching production, constantly pitching competition, constantly pitching these indicators, which increasingly for people are meaningless because we're not happy. It's very simple. We're not happy. But meantime, nobody is having the conversation in any realistic way about the impact of the world around us, and actually how that affects how we are, how we live, our wellness, our happiness. And this is one of the things, Extinction Rebellion, in terms of the three demands, and a quotation which always sticks out for me, and again drew me to Extinction Rebellion and its work, was that George Orwell quote, and it's like, in times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, because we're not getting the truth from systems, etc., around us, and this is part of it. But in addition to looking after ourselves as humans, part of Extinction Rebellion is how we are as a movement, and there are a number of different types of groups. So if you become involved in anything with Extinction Rebellion, it is looking at you as a holistic, the whole person. So, do you see that saucepan over there? That's actually very indicative of the essence of the whole movement in terms of food plays a part. There's a regeneration group which supports people going on actions, etc., that you are regenerated. Looks after the emotional well-being. There's always a very practical focus on emotional well-being. And please, anybody jump in here, because I know I'm quite new. But and emotional well-being is another part, because even a very simple thing when you're at meetings is a very human thing. You will people will check in with your well-being, like Kaitlyn did at the start, and flag that up, and check in at the end on your well-being. So there's a regeneration element to it, and Kaitlyn, we were talking about, is very much involved in the arts group, and that is another aspect in terms of what Extinction Rebellion brings. And I think, Kaitlyn, what was it, the making of the massive fish at the moment, isn't that right?
Being a fish gallery for the St. Patrick's Day parade.
Yes. So Kaitlyn is beavering away and doubling up on her A-level art making as we speak, for the greater good. And then there is, in terms of groups within each local movement, talked about regeneration, we've talked about then art. There's also community outreach, and Helen, who just left there, as part of bringing out the message to more people, as another element of how Extinction Rebellion works, as a movement. And then coordinating groups for talks and actions, which is what we're doing tonight, and also as well, but most importantly, is building on the whole concept of actions and logistics. And when Extinction Rebellion talks about actions, we've mentioned a few already. Some of the more famous actions would be, I don't know if anybody remembers the big pink boat. Yes, I don't know where that is now. Is that?
Well, it's on its way.
Is it on its way, Leon? I remember you talking about a boat and quietly. It's on its way, so it will be Ireland bound as well. But those.
This is one from from Dublin.
Yes,
so
talking about. There are two. Yeah.
And then we'll be on the St. Patrick's Day with the fish scallops.
Great. Yeah.
If anybody wants to get joined in with that as well, there's a huge element.
So sorry, because I don't have the slides, so I'm doing a quick old style flick through a few pages here, but we're nearly there, just in case, because I don't want to forget anything. In terms of the other thing to mention was Citizens' Assembly, and I don't know if we want to go into much detail on that, because I am very aware of the time. In addition to the other two demands, the third demand that we do work on, and this is connecting very locally to our infrastructure and our political systems, is the Citizens' Assembly. If anybody is not familiar with what a Citizens' Assembly is, I will try and sum it up in 3 sentences. It does what it says on the tin, is an assembly, but it is actually made up of citizens who are selected randomly to reflect the electorate strata, in terms of age, gender, etc., profile. And citizens' assemblies are tasked to get citizens to look at specific pieces or topics. So, for example, the Irish Citizens' Assembly had a huge amount of success over 2018, 2019, where it very specifically looked at difficult issues which people and parties really wrangled with, such as abortion law reform in the South, which, as we all know, was huge. And also as well it looked at climate change. So the Citizens' Assembly will gather citizens and they will take them away for maybe 1-2 days, usually over a weekend. They might meet up to 10 or 12 times a year, but they will bring in expertise on a specific issue, and citizens who are at the Assembly will delve in, investigate, and then make recommendations following information and input, following informed debate amongst them, and those recommendations will go back to, for example, the regional legislator. The demand for ourselves is a dedicated Citizens' Assembly on climate emergency. How easy that will be to get, we don't know. But Citizens' Assembly are part of a deliberative democracy movement, which is trying to get citizens closer to decision making. They're not the silver bullet, they're only part of it. But it is a start, and that is one of the demands that we will be making locally. So a quick quiz for you is actually just on our own recent Assembly meeting. Now, does anybody want to have a guess at how many of our local MLAs voted in the climate emergency debate? Go on, give us a number.
I have a number in mind.
Go on. Half, which would be roughly.
Oh, I don't know. Like
I'm testing you. You've talked all evening. Anybody else want to have a guess? No? Yeah.
I'm just doing the 48.
48?
Yeah, 48.
Sorry, I feel like one of those daytime TV auctions. Yes, 48 will go. Actually, it was 75. 48 voted, you are absolutely right, as in 4 to declare a climate emergency. But I have to say 27 voted against. So that's basically a third of our local elected reps stepping up. Do you know what I mean when you hear? So this is in terms of if you want, to strengthen for a citizens' assembly, and especially one dedicated to climate change, I think you don't have to look any further. And if you really want to, well, I was in two minds. I was quite depressed when I read through the transcript of the debate in our assembly, because you can get it on the BBC News website, and it gives you a breakdown of what each MLA said at each part of the debate. And part of me just laughed, I have to say, with some of the comments. One of my favourite was from a particular MLA who went, do you know what, I'm not really sure about the evidence, because I've been around a long time and I've seen a lot of different weather. That's what, this is where we're at. This is where we're at. So in terms of a citizens' assembly, that is one of the demands. I think we've covered. The other thing to say is just the structure of Extinction Rebellion. If you're coming in expecting, the usual committee structure of a head and a chair and a hierarchy, it doesn't work that way. It is a web, it is flat, and it is also exceptionally flexible in terms of it operates what I see very clearly as a strengths-based ethos. So what I think of head, hands and heart, everybody has something they know, everybody has something they can do, everybody has a passion they can follow, and there is room for this to use your passions, your skills and talents within Extinction Rebellion flexibly, whichever way you desire. So I've given you a flavour just of some of the groups. There is also flexibility for people to bring their own issues with the likes of affinity groups. And you can give as much or as little, well, I don't mean as little, but tailored to your lifestyle as you can. And that is also something I would stress. And it is a movement. And what we do want to do is grow, because to have any type of systemic change requires, I think, 3.5% of the population. That's where we're aiming to grow in Northern Ireland, to tipping points, so that we don't have to read conversations of our local elected reps talking about their experience of the weather. That's it. So I don't think, I'm very aware of the time here, so I think if we covered everything, is there anything you'd like to add? No? Yeah.
So Gilsall can be quite depressing.
Yes.
There's a huge thing on anxiety now, especially in the younger generation.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of depression and mental health surrounding the anxiety that the youth are having with, not just the youth.
No.
People who are aware. People who are becoming aware.
Yeah.
We're also aware.
No,
Yeah.
I think people who are aware of the issues are becoming overwhelmed and becoming very anxious. And certainly I've experienced that myself as well. And my twin brother is also quite like, he can't deal with it, and you just think, what's the point? I may as well just play PlayStation kind of situation. But I find something that's been very remedying is actually taking some action and actually taking. And so I would definitely say, if you want to go out here and actually do something now as well in terms of the getting involved with Extinction Rebellion, is to increase awareness. And actually to feel like you're doing something for the climate as well. I mean, I think that's a little bit about recycling and doing your bit. It doesn't make a huge impact, but also it does make you feel good, and that's important. Looking at your own well-being is very, very good. The awareness, you would be surprised. You guys are probably quite aware because you're already here. There's a selective kind of filter in that. But I was at a meeting yesterday at Queen's, and in the biology department, someone had just mentioned that, because we were talking about vegetarian sandwiches or not having its Northern Ireland Science Festival on Saturday. and we're saying what we should feed ourselves with, and they're like, oh no, don't worry, it doesn't have to be vegetarian sandwiches, because it's more about where you're sourcing your food rather than what you're sourcing your food from, you know, in terms of people or plants. Which is completely wrong. I mean, there's evidence. And these are scientists, these are the senior members of the department.
Yeah.
So you'd be surprised by how little awareness there is at every level of society.
And I think in terms of, and I do, it's a really important point, Colin, in terms of resilience. I mean, my own background, I worked for years in the community and voluntary sector, and I have my own coaching business, but I have a very personal passion about resilience, in terms of coaching, also having grown up with a parent who's been ricocheted in with serious mental illness. And it can be, a lot of people are suffering from anxiety and mental health well-being issues already. This layered on top, and I know this from conversations, it can be very crippling. But as Colin said, two big things about resilience. When you feel out of control or your well-being starts to deteriorate is when you think you can't do anything. And action is key to resilience. It doesn't matter what you do. The smallest thing in whatever situation you find yourself in, not just even talking about climate emergency, helps you start to feel more in control. The other big aspect is social connectivity. That when we connect together, automatically, it's core to our well-being anyway in terms of resilience. But when you combine the two, looking at issues like this, that is an exceptionally powerful alchemy. And that's why we're here. And we're nice people. Honestly. We give you dal. Where else do you get that? So I think, that's all I have to say, but I suppose it's really opening up to any questions. And can I just thank everybody for their presence and participation? You have been very good and sitting on high stools particularly. Not really my forte. Congratulate you. And I suppose it's just open for questions.
Yeah.
Kaitlyn, do you want to go up and do some of the moderation?
Point of people, okay.
It's one of the things I like about Extinction Rebellion as well, so it does give you, if there's just things that you're really interested in, they sort of give you that free rein to get involved with it. So, and then it's also a bit of training as well. So, and this is facilitation training, just sort of push her in. So has anyone got any questions? I had one for Colin. You can ask any three of us. So I heard a lot of, you were talking about indigenous cultures and stuff, and I hear it sometimes coming from, let's just say the left generally, but also from Extinction Rebellion specifically, and it seemed like there was a wee bit of over romanticism or orientalism towards indigenous cultures. It was fascinating to hear that.
Yeah, even the suits care. Yeah. I think especially because it's the only part of the land that's managed which is not declining at the rate that everywhere else is. So they're really seeing the importance that Indigenous people have in the ecosystem and the practices that they're actually performing. On a large scale, when you take it to the scale of all Indigenous people in all lands, is actually making an impact. Without them, if we were kind of declining the land use and the exploiting the land at the rate at which we would normally do it, there wouldn't be a lot left. So Indigenous people have really made such an impact in that. So it was really, I was not expecting that in the report. So it was really nice to see that and to see that they appreciate their practices and want to try to bring in those practices into thinking about a global response to that. Capitalist kind of.
Well, yes, almost antithesis of capitalism. Private ownership is like almost the deep-rooted rocks of capitalism. Like your personal sovereignty and then sovereignty over a section of land. It's all muddled up once you get the co-ops. So.
Does anybody think that Northern Ireland?
Oh, sorry, one second, Chris. I'm fully there.
Jump on as well.
I know Chris so well.
Catherine's in charge.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Of course, yeah.
As a networked organisation, how are decisions made? If you decide you're going to have an event or do something, how are decisions made?
Well, there's the coordination group, and basically one person can facilitate a meeting, so it's not exactly like a head person kind of like controls the layout or the agenda of the meeting. You'll have one person who will we use things like hand signals to be able to, in large groups, communicate. Like if you have a point, you put up one finger. If you have a direct point that leads off someone else's, like the topic they're talking about, you put up two fingers. And if you, there's a lot of it's very kind of loose ruling, but it does work as a way, as opposed to sort of that more business-like hierarchy where you have one person chairing a meeting, they're in control, and like then things like bias can play into that, which can control how the meeting, like the result of the meeting. So it's very equal in that way. Like it's a really nice sort of community ethos that everyone does have a say, and the facilitator, it's their responsibility to make sure that everyone's voice and opinion is heard, like to the full extent. And yeah, so it's sort of like that, yeah.
Yeah, if you come along to one of our open meetings, you can probably try and, because it's sort of seeing is believing sometimes, and it's really interesting to see, like, it's really about bringing out that group dynamic, the emergent idea, rather than any one person's idea. And when it happens, it's like, wow, because everybody can feel like it's their idea. You know what I mean? It goes better than any.
Yeah, add to that though as well, within like local groups, there's no sort of like centralized like London, like the group that London controls everything. Every single group is kind of individual in their own sort of way and has their own strengths and weaknesses and their own range of people with different skills. It's not like, I mean, we do like communicate with the Dublin group and stuff, help them getting the boat down for Paddy's Day, things like that, but it's not like there's any sort of like one group that like that hands out, could control or like gives out advice on how you should run it. It's very much like you make it work how your local group sees fit.
Sorry.
We haven't had anybody arrested yet, have we?
Over here, have we?
Chris is a radical, like not even in the Republic. They wouldn't arrest us in the Republic.
You know, they really does move the cops. They wouldn't arrest us.
They might have our number.
Asking a judge for the truth is being radical. I mean, what Marie said about petitions, and we have a petition against the road going through a multi-designated site, and thousands of people have signed it, and we've had 10 years of awareness raising because the council didn't even know where this place was, and nobody seems to have ever set eyes on it, and it'll only be seen when they've opened it up to a motorway, when they think, oh, this is great, you know, it's nowhere else to be. And it is, and I've been in nature conservation. I came here 35 years to work for the RSPB, and we've been writing letters and lobbying, and it's just going down the tube. 35 years of watching what's happening in Northern Ireland, it is a disaster, the environment in Northern Ireland. It's much worse than across the water. It's bad there, they talk about HS2, but at least there's lots of people making a big fuss about it. There's none of the, apart from Friends of the Earth and now Extinction Rebellion, nobody's really making a fuss about this site, which has got international designations, not ancient woodlands, wonderful as they are, or sites of special scientific interest. We're talking about a Ramsar site, we're talking about special protection areas. These are international designations because this is the wetland that is the most important wetland in the British Isles for 10 species of waterbird.
Like Loch Bay.
Yeah, Loch Bay and Loch Ness, and none of our politicians give it down.
It's really funny when the infrastructure industry actually becomes the one breaking the law.
Yeah. So I'm at the point,
and
you have to do something, otherwise you do feel powerless, and so you take legal action because you see it's unlawful, and you find out about the law, and you go through all the stages of the law, and at every court and at every stage, everybody lies to you. And then you're at the point, well, then really the only thing left is direct action.
Yeah, pretty much.
We're forced to it. Nobody wants to spend their Monday night or Thursday night here, you know, really, much as you're all lovely, you know.
Well, I hope we've entertained.
It's so bloody depressing though, hearing about all this stuff.
Yeah, no, it is depressing, and it is, like, eco-anxiety is actually the term that's been given in the media. And it is hard to deal with and hard to accept, to realise that, like, if you have kids or even just, like, if you're a young person and it's really hard to judge what's happening or what's going to happen in your future. There's no sort of clear-cut evidence, you don't know the fake news, stuff like that, you don't really know what to trust. And then when you see the facts that are, like, peer-reviewed, and it's really brutal and depressing, like, what can you as an individual actually do to not feel completely helpless? And I think that's what the basic effects is to try and engage people, bring people together, because loneliness is the worst part of it. If you feel that you're alone in the issue, then it can spiral and get worse. Like mental health, it's disastrous. But bring people together and talking about it and sharing that sort of eco-anxiety, and then actually using that negative energy towards something that might actually be useful. Like you might see in the news last week in Bristol, an XR group actually kind of disrupted the building of a airplane runway, and it got called off, which was absolutely fantastic. So like direct action, it does actually work. It's not just for the crack or trying to make yourself feel better, you know. It can actually work, but it takes a lot of people with a lot of passion to make that happen, and you can't just cover your ears and pretend that it doesn't exist. You know?
There's a certain interest in the direct action as well. Like, so XRs really try to push this idea, the colourful and creative and theatric part of it. And someone commented it's a good way of keeping it non-violent. So if you keep people smiling, they're less likely to start throwing stones.
Yeah. They give people, like, when they block the roads in London, they're giving people, like, playing music and dancing and giving people cake, because it's like, this is a celebration, not a like violent thing. It's not malicious or angry. It's just trying to disrupt, like, business as usual, basically.
And actually, one thing to look up would be, one of my favourites is, if you want to see some fun disruptive action, disobedience.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Oh, I thought you made that up, Leon.
Google disobedience. Go back, Google disobedience and XR. Yeah, absolutely. And it sums all of that up.
Yes, it's happening.
It sums all of it up.
I'm not a big fan of crazies, I must admit.
We can do better.
The tune could change, but
We'll bring it up to the 80s instead of the 70s.
exactly.
But there's a certain value in disruption. There's a philosophy behind it as well. Like, so as an example, if you're having a heart attack, your heart's actually spun out of rhythm, it's sort of beating all over the place, and you disrupt it, and then it goes back to its original rhythm. So it's not just about, you know, it's partially about hitting them where it hurts, you know, financially, but it's also about you find new ways of doing things when disrupted. Because as we saw from Colin's talk, most of what the damage being done to the natural world, it's only, what, like 20% is climate change right now? Leave it about 40 years, it might be 50 or 60%. Most of it's land usage, and that's one of the sort of, in a way, climate change might even be a benefit for humanity, because it'll force us to think like a planetary species, and not just everybody sort of stabbing each other in the back or, you know, pinching each other's pocket. So.
Just transition.
And then the other thing as well that Philip Allen pointed out was the sand extraction from Loch Ness, and it's the question of its legality. Like 90, well, it's over 90% now of eagles have been lost from Loch Ness area, and you know, it's precipitous decline. It's one of the most richest biodiversity areas, particularly in the north, but also just in Ireland, and it's just completely neglected. It just seems to be like, you know, nobody really cares, so it's might as well just take what you can, give nothing back, and won't be left with nothing in the end.
Common pig farms.
Oh, pig farms, yeah. Partly one of them was denied planning permission recently.
Yay!
So, but there's a local and there's a global. That's the thing, you know. So you want to fight local issues, but you want to keep out sort of your eye on the local.
I was just saying about trying to disrupt where money's made and stuff like that as well. So part of it is to increase awareness and get people to commit to XR as well. So whenever there are larger global days, we can make a presence there in Dublin or London, and add to the numbers to try to disrupt the global capital, the global economic capitals of the countries.
Yeah,
and that's really where a lot of the impact as well. Yeah. But we need a good number from Belfast to do that. So we did have quite a good number last year go to Dublin.
Yeah, possibly. Dublin love it. They really do. They want it back. They invite it back to shut them down.
And of course we have the COP, the next one that follows the Paris Agreement is going to be in Glasgow this year. So that will be ideally with several busloads of people over for that, for a little bit of fun and disruption for a few weeks. Well, I don't know, how long does it run for? Like a time for let's say a week. The next COP. It's on in next November in Glasgow.
Right.
Thanks, Kaitlyn.
Yes, thank you.